Thank you, Dhruvi. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Hats off to the entire team of Diavicon, Dr. Pratap Deshmanali, Dr. Pansi Sabu, and the entire team. It's a phenomenal session going on. My job is pretty simple. I am here to introduce the first speaker from United Kingdom, Dr. Samuel Seidu. He is a practicing Leicester general practitioner. He's an undergraduate tutor and a GP trainer at the Hockley Farm Medical Practice, primary care research fellow in diabetes at the University of Leicester, and an honorary primary care lecturer at the Leicester Diabetes Center. His area of interest is diabetes, improving quality in diabetes care, a regular reviewer of the related articles submitted to peer-reviewed journals such as Diabetes Research, Clinical Practice, Diabetes Medicines, Primary Care, Diabetes Europe Journal, the European Journal of Medical Informatics, and the BMJ. He also reviews abstracts related to diabetes submitted for the national and international conferences. He is also an associate editor for the Primary Care Diabetes Journal and also editorial advisory board member, the Australian Family Practice Journal. Currently, he is the head of research for Primary Care Diabetes Europe and also the chair of the PCDE study group of European Association for Study of Diabetes. He's currently a clinical lead and mentor for diabetes in Leicester City, involved in design and reconfiguration of diabetes care in Leicester alongside other clinical leads in primary and secondary care, and member of the Primary Care Academy of Diabetes Specialists in the UK, and liaises with other leading GPs. So obviously an extremely learned and a sort of authority in the subject of diabetes and diabetes care. We welcome him to talk to us this afternoon, and his topic at hand is real-world evidence, utility in evaluating diabetes treatment. So over to Dr. Samuel Seidu, please.
Amit said the poll question.
Right.
We have the poll question there.
Yeah.
Do real-world evidence have any impact on your clinical decision making in type 2 diabetes management?
Very much. Completely agree.
Maybe
Can we actually have the poll question window over here?
Can I screen share, please?
Yeah.
Ruby, already done by poll.
Right.
Poll has already happened.
Okay.
Dr. Samuel, please share your screen.
Okay. Yes. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in the conference. Yes. I'm taking the call from Leicester Diabetes Center. You've had a brief introduction about myself, and thanks for the kind words. So yes, these are my disclosures. A few seconds to go through them. Okay, the outline of my session today is going to be to look at the nature of real-world evidence and how the perception of such evidence is changing in the scientific community.
Excuse me, sir, you have to share your screen. Your screen is not visible.
Okay.
There's a green color tab at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
So can you see the share screen button at the bottom?
I'm trying to find it. It's taking me out now.
It's right next to the chat button.
Bottom of your screen.
Can you see that now?
No, sir.
Right.
On your Zoom application, sir, not on your presentation.
Yeah, it's a Zoom application. I'm on there now.
So on the bottom, there is a share screen button. That would be a green color button. Yes.
Is that better?
Yes. Just put it on slideshow mode.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes. I can see you.
Good.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so apologies for the technical hitch-up. So the outline is going to be to look at the nature of real-world evidence and how the perception of this, is changing the diabetes care in the real world. We shall describe how real-world evidence can be used in particular in relation to diabetes treatments. So basically, when we talk about real-world evidence, there are different definitions. Some people define real-world evidence as everything that goes beyond what we find normally in our phase 3 clinical trials. And others describe real-world evidence as a measure of how our understanding of healthcare data collected under real, clinical settings can be applied for patient care. But the definition that I prefer to use actually is that it's data that is derived from medical practice among heterogeneous patient groups in the real world setting. So how does that differ from the randomized control trials? Well, we have been used to randomized control trials for generations, and we regard randomized control trials as a gold standard research designs to answer clinical questions. And some of the reasons why they have these advantages are that they are constructed under very stringent trial designs. Randomized controlled trials have controlled, environments, and there are very restrictive inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so because of that, because they are randomized, you are able to eliminate all the known and unknown confounding factors. And the data that you derive from randomized controlled trials normally will be from one source. And so there is a very high internal validity in which in such a way that you can use the data from randomized controlled trials to answer specific questions pertaining to the patient groups that the trials were set on. Conversely, in the real world evidence section, the data are usually of very varied designs, and they come from the real world during real clinical practice. The inclusion and exclusion criteria are a lot more liberal. So you have to rely on very good statistical methodologies to be able to eliminate all the known confounding factors as much as you can. And having said that, as much as you try to eliminate the confounding factor, there will be some that are unknown that you cannot actually eliminate completely. So data derived from the real world is usually from multiple sources. And as a result of it, you have a very high external validity. In other words, you can use the data here to apply to a wide area of the population. In summary, the randomized controlled trials are actually used by policymakers or pharmaceutical industry to decide the efficacy of interventions or drugs. Simply put, the question is whether the drug or the intervention can work. Whereas in the case of the real world evidence, it is actually answering a different question. Does it actually work? So it's not so much the case of whether it can work, but does it actually work in the real world? And so we talk about efficacy in randomized controlled trials and effectiveness in the real world setting. There are some advantages and disadvantages of both sources of data. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. We all know that. We've used that for generations. You are able to eliminate all confounding factors, and they are used for regulatory approvals by pharmaceutical industry. They are very expensive though, and because they are designed in a very select population groups with very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, you can only apply the data from randomized controlled trials to a very select population. You cannot generalize the information that you get from randomized controlled trial onto the general population, and I'll come back to that later. Conversely, in the real world, it's a lot cheaper to get these trials done. It's more economical and time efficient. The effectiveness in clinical practice is possible with data from real world evidence. It includes, data for, health outcomes, resource utilization, and funding implications. The downside, however, is that, like I said earlier on, you can never eliminate all the confounding factors. There will be some that are known that you can do something about by using sophisticated statistical methodologies, but there are others that you will not know at all exist. There is less burdensome. It's less burdensome to conduct, observational studies in the general population, and because of that, sometimes you do come up with a lot of missing data, which can be very tricky to account for when you're doing the analysis in the real-world data settings. So what are the sources of real-world evidence? Well, there are several sources. You can get them from health surveys. You can also get them from claims databases. In the UK, we rely on electronic health records a lot. You can also get them from, pragmatic trials, and I'll come back to that. These are randomized control trials in the real world, or you can get them from observational patient registry data. So what are pragmatic trials? So pragmatic trials are, randomized control. They can be randomized, trials, but in the real world setting. So the patient is behaving as they would normally do in their day-to-day life, not under experimental conditions. And the clinicians can decide to use them as an experiment, one group having the intervention and the other group not having the intervention, and try as much as possible to make it simulate the real world setting, but using various statistical methodologies to make it mimic a randomized control trial. And so the data that you get from there will lead onto the real world evidence, which you can use to make policy changes. So what are the outcomes that we can get from real world evidence? Well, treatment adherence and persistence. This is something that you don't commonly get in randomized controlled trials. We can also measure healthcare utilization, patient-reported outcomes, clinical outcomes, quality of life measures, and psychological factors, and then the financial burden on patients and healthcare systems. All this data you can get from real-world evidence, but most randomized controlled trials, if you were to power a randomized controlled trial to come up with outcomes of this nature, you will need very, very large numbers, and that will be too expensive to conduct. And so various stakeholders have different interest areas in the real-world evidence. For the prescribers, if you are in the front line and you are prescribing, you want to know what the demographic characteristics of your population are, the race, the ethnicity, and different comorbidities. All of that will determine what you prescribe. And that can be that information can be got from real-world evidence. Regulatory authorities can also use real-world evidence to determine the characteristics and influence of various treatment outcomes in the real world. And of course, payers, it is in a health economy, the payers always decide who gets what. And so they will depend on the pricing and cost effectiveness of interventions to decide what to make available to patients. And indeed, insurance companies will also need real-world evidence to decide what to insure and what not to insure. So if you then plot a population against study design, what you will find is that in randomized controlled trials, they have a very narrow population base, but these patients recruited for randomized controlled trials are actually very highly motivated. On the other side of the spectrum, in observational studies, you can recruit patients from the whole population, but there is less motivation for these patients. In some cases, you don't actually have direct patient contact. So if you compare the observational studies, if you can come up with a research design that will eliminate as much as possible all the confounding and known and unknown confounding factors, you will possibly be coming up with evidence that will be applicable to the whole population. The downside, however, is that this will be technically very difficult. On the other side of the spectrum, randomized controlled trials, they are very well constructed, but the applicability is to a very small population base. So in the middle here will be a compromise where you have pragmatic trials, which will be dependent on the real world setting, but employing the methodologies of a randomized controlled trial. So in this case, you can have real world data, but you can choose to randomize and have a comparator so that you can compare. And so this is a middle ground. And this sort of trial, these sort of trials are becoming more and more common. In diabetes, what we find is that if you look at the A1C reduction from randomized controlled trials, that seems to be a lot lower than in the real world setting. And so if you have an intervention or a drug manufactured, in all cases, the A1C reduction that you achieve in the control trials is usually very good. If you then release that drug onto the public, you don't get as good an A1C reduction compared to the RCT section. That gap between the real world evidence achievement of A1C control and the clinical trial achievement of A1C control is what we refer to as the efficacy gap. Now, this efficacy gap can be determined by a few factors, and notably amongst those factors will be medication adherence and persistence. These patients in randomized controlled trials are very motivated and they will take their drugs all the time. Whereas in the real world, patients in this population are usually not that motivated because sometimes patients here will not have been recruited in the randomized controlled trial. These patients could include patients with multimorbidities, patients with severe mental illness, and all of these will have problems taking medications. Therapeutic inertia is another reason why in the real world we don't achieve A1C control as compared to the randomized controlled trials. And finally, pricing from regulatory authorities can prevent clinicians from prescribing medications in the real world setting. So how about the use of real world evidence in diabetes treatments? Well, metformin is our first line diabetes agent globally, and so I will start with metformin. A while ago, there was uncertainty about how best to manage patients with heart failure when they need glycemic control. It was unsure whether metformin would actually increase lactic acidosis. It was the use of real-world evidence that generated substantial evidence for the FDA to reverse that argument in 2005. A systematic review that was completed back in 2013 by Dean Urich and co. Pooled a 340,000 patients from different observational studies. And in this study, they realized that metformin was just as safe as all other glycemic agents in heart failure. How about the GLP-1 receptor agonists? Well, we have been using he was the first to be licensed, and then we got Victoza or liraglutide later on. In the UK, we have the ABCD audit, which is basically real-world collection of data after the introduction of these new agents. So the first two GLP-1 receptor agonists that were licensed in the UK, exenatide and liraglutide, were audited. And clinicians were asked to produce their data on A1C reduction, hypoglycemia, weight, side effects, insulin use, combinations, lipid control, cardiovascular events, and non-responders. And we measured, effectiveness of, these GLP-1 receptor agonists in patients with very high BMS, those with long duration diabetes, background therapies, and we also measured effects on A1C and weight in different ethnic groups and their associations with cardiovascular events. And we also looked for pancreatitis. This is the data, the results for the first two audits in the ABCD audit collected in real time. A1C reduction was consistently low, below 1% from baseline. what we did find was that at that time, NICE using the evidence for randomized controlled trials, which basically, excluded patients with BMIs more than 40, kind of put a lot of restrictions on the prescribing of these agents. And what we found was that in the real world, you got A1C reductions consistently, higher and higher in patients with higher BMIs. So you actually got better A1C reduction in patients who had high BMIs. And these patient populations were not actually included in the randomized control trials. So here we're getting evidence in the real world setting that we wouldn't have got from randomized control trials. How about the SGLT2 inhibitor class? Again, I'll just take you through some data from the dapagliflozin phase 3 program, looking at A1C and weight reduction. In this graph, in this figure, what you find is that 2/3 of patients achieved both A1C control and weight loss in the randomized control trials. So in the real world setting, what we want to see is if we repeated this sort of trial in the real world setting, are we going to get a similar sort of data to give reassurance to patients and clinicians that the drug is actually effective? And the data from the real world setting is actually very similar. Indeed, we have about 70.2% of patients achieving both A1C reduction and weight loss at the same time. How about insulin? There's been a lot of real world evidence on all the newer insulins, but I'll just pick one for the sake of time. The DELIVER-2 study looked at insulin glargine U300 in the real world and was meant to evaluate the clinical outcomes of patients with type 2 diabetes using U300, using other basal insulin who were switched to insulin glargine U300 from other insulins. And the other insulins can include detemir, degludec, or any other insulin. And what you found was that there was a similar achievement A1C control in patients that you switched to JO. And also there were comparable reductions in A1C in both groups. But more importantly, you found less hypoglycemia in patients who were switched over to insulin glargine U300. And this was the case for hypoglycemias needing inpatient care. So the take-home message, and this is my final slide, is that real-world studies utilize broad range of data from different sources in the real clinical setting. And the real-world evidence can complement randomized control trials. And different diabetes treatments in the real-world setting can provide insights into the broad range of effects for both clinicians, patients, and policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sample. You have given a very comprehensive account how the real world study they work and what is the difference between